Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Neil Woodhams, President of MSNZ and a trustee of the MS New Zealand Research Trust. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. What's really impressive with this audience is the number of people that have come from out of town, including the South Island, Wellington. We've coincided this evening meeting with a two-day training session for our community advisors. So there are in the audience 20-odd people from all around the country, from Southland to Northland, who provide service to people with MS in the field. And so particular welcome to them. We had a pretty interesting day today and there's another full day tomorrow. There are also some other people that I'd like to particularly welcome. Dr. Ernie Willoughby, who will speak in just a minute. Members of the executive of MS New Zealand, members of the board of the MS Research Trust are also here. So welcome, and if I have missed anybody that's travelled a long distance, you're very, very welcome. So the title of this seminar is Brain Health, and Professor Butzkueven will talk in more detail. But first of all, I do want to thank also our sponsors, Roche, Merck, Novartis, and the Research Trust, all of whom have made this evening possible. In 2023, MS New Zealand won the Teams Award for MS Brain Health. And there's a picture there of the team with our award, and I think the award is on the desk outside. But this was an international competition, and the organisation that awarded us, Helmut, has been very, very much involved. But it was awarded for our advocacy efforts in improving the lives of people with MS in New Zealand by getting a whole range now of effective drugs. And so it's appropriate that we just do acknowledge the work of Amanda and the team at MSNZ, some of whom are here tonight, just the amount of effort and that went into winning that award. So with no further ado, I'd call on Dr. Ernest Willoughby to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to introduce Helmut, who's an old friend and a leading figure in MS research, not just in Australia, where he's based in Melbourne, but internationally. And we're very grateful to Helmut, who's pretty busy, for giving up his time to come over and help us cross in the shaky isles. As Neil mentioned, he's been here before and he was instrumental in pushing Pharmac to put more funds into treatments for MS. And he's been with Neil the last day or two back at Pharmac pushing the case further. So we hope to hear more on that. Helmut wears many hats. I'm just going to mention the main ones. He's head of the multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology unit at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, a major centre. He's head of the Department of Neuroscience at Monash University, which tells you a lot. He's the managing director of MS Base, a major registry of MS internationally, and I think he's going to be mentioning that, maybe. He's been encouraging New Zealand to become more involved, which we think is very important. And he's a board member of MS Australia, which is, oh, you're not anymore. Okay, he may have resigned. I won't go into that. Well, he still has plenty on his plate, and we're be very interested to hear him talking. He's involved in MS research in a whole range of areas, and I think he's just going to select some of his favourite topics to discuss, and I'm sure we'll take questions when he's finished. Helmut.
Thanks, Ernie. I tend towards talks with information overload, so I try to hobble myself a little bit to really talk about some of the most pertinent and up-and-coming things that will be important for people with MS to know. It's a real pleasure to be back in New Zealand at the invitation of MS New Zealand. The MS Society here is incredibly active, and I had a real pleasure of meeting with the community advisors this morning, which was, to be honest, an humbling experience. A lot of incredible people working to improve the lives of MS, and that's what we all want to do. So it's a real pleasure to be back, even if your immigration almost didn't let me in. So what I decided in the end to talk about was a bit of an update of Brain Health, which is an initiative, actually an organization that was formed out of a theme that resonates today in New Zealand and Australia, but it was because a leading MS neurologist in the UK, Gavin Giovannoni, really discovered that there was huge inequity in the British Isles in terms of access to neurologists, access to treatments, and that the various health trusts behaved completely differently. And he wanted to create an organization that would, in general, lobby for better care, better standards of care for people with MS, but also by people with MS. So I'll tell you, it'll mostly spend time talking about that journey and its outcomes and its future. I'll talk a little bit about vitamin D, which is close to my heart. And then I thought I would focus on progressive MS. There's a lot happening in progressive MS, so I want to talk about the new drugs, the new approaches for progressive MS. And also talk to you about pearls and cells. I'll tell you about that later. And a little bit on active self-monitoring and also the underlying infrastructure that we need to conduct trials of the future. So still a lot. So brain health, I'll talk about 3 stages of it. The first stage is the report that was launched in October 2015, which was trying to set a global standard of care. So I'll talk about that process and its evaluation and how we have used and want to use the tool in the future to actually improve care for people with MS. So brain health principles are pretty generic. It's not just about people with MS. It's arguably about people trying to prevent or reduce the impact of neurological diseases, including aging, which I'm finding myself in the beginnings of, in all of us. So, but there is the hardcore health service management of the disease still at its core. And it's this concept of monitoring, which I think we almost really introduced with the Brain Health Report in 2015, which is now extremely widespread. So in another chat this afternoon, people were talking about how many MRIs they'd had, and I'm getting an MRI scan once a year, but they only do my spinal cord occasionally, or I've only had a few MRI scans, and part of that monitoring is is important to talk about because it's not obvious. Like the early disease is largely hidden. Right? So a lot of the early disease activity, brain lesions and spinal cord lesions, may not cause any or really non-specific symptoms, and people don't recognize them. If you think about that, that's completely different to, let's say, if you had rheumatoid arthritis, right, or you had diabetes. Diabetes you can measure really easily at home with a blood glucose monitor. And if you have rheumatoid arthritis and it's not well controlled, you get really bad joint pain. So you almost immediately know if treatments are working, and people are self-monitoring all the time, because if their pain gets bad, they're going to say something. Someone who can develop 20 new silent MS lesions without any symptoms and not going to say anything. So it's much more important for us to create a framework for detection, because self-detection is impossible. MS goes for a whole lifetime, and I think thanks to many, many advances in MS care, that lifetime is pretty much normal, like a normal lifespan. Not a completely undesirable lifespan. I'm talking about the duration of the lifespan. So we should maximize brain health and never sit and forget. So as a person with MS, what can you do specifically when you are interacting with the healthcare system? Now that's an interesting concept, because many people are still feel that the doctors are the boss, but we think it's a team. I don't. You have, as a person with MS, I think the right to have access to your plan and some knowledge about that. So, when you, for example, have a scan, you should take some interest in what it actually shows. Do you have new lesions or not? If it's more than one or more than two, is there some plan? Could we change treatment or not? And you can ask these questions, and we encourage and that's all in the report, really, is that people should be proactive about the healthcare, if possible. If they're not having regular MRI scans and they're on a particular treatment, we would like people to ask their neurologists to perhaps do one. Because it helps to ensure that your treatment is working as well as possible. And thanks to many people, but especially the MS societies here, the access to highly effective treatment in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis in New Zealand is much, much, much better than it used to be. And there are therefore options. You've got a bunch of great drugs here, and if one of them isn't working well, maybe you should switch to another one. There's health literacy, understanding what a treatment can and can't do. And this is a bit cheeky, this last point, because I'm a registry person. We run the largest registry in the world in multiple sclerosis. So we really want people to collect that data, because if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. My favorite quote of all time. It'll probably come up later in the book. But so, is your care team actually doing something about that? It's, do they have some kind of systematic way of actually capturing the data that on you or for you? Okay. We shouldn't let MS control us. Time is brain. And as a person with MS, you should be in charge of that, of the plan to preserve your brain as much as possible. And there are a bunch of things that we said in 2015 people with MS should really do for themselves. If they smoke, they should try to stop smoking. And one of my other sort of favorite quotes is, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it more than 20 times already. Thankfully, I never got addicted to it, but it's really tough. But there are resources there, and we know that unfortunately continuing smokers overall are about 30% worse from their MS, so it has a very direct impact on them. Make sure you get some sun and you're not vitamin D deficient, but more about that later. Eat healthier, up to a point, of course, but we all know what the sort of food pyramid is like, and all the fried stuff on the top of the, should be like occasionally used, and the more lean meats, fruit, vegetables. We all know. But as you get to my age, in your 50s, and even before that, if you have any other chronic health conditions that also impact the health of your brain through vascular disease mainly, you should be managing those very proactively. So if you happen to develop non-insulin dependent diabetes or high blood pressure, you need to try and get those under control as much as possible and not ignore them. And there are a number of significant issues that many people with MS have around their mental health. Many people develop at some point in their life a period of depression or excessive anxiety. Bladder issues are super common in people with MS. Sleep disturbances, the impact that excessive fatigue has on cognition and so on is huge. And these are problems that can be discussed and sometimes helped. Actually, often improve. But if you don't discuss them, people don't discuss them, then they won't improve them at all. And then it said try to exercise at least twice a week. But we do have a physiotherapist who she's going to tell you it's nowhere near enough. So what changed what's sort of different in the 9 years since we wrote that report? Well, the exercise recommendation it has gone up a lot. There's very substantial evidence around needing to exercise actually more than twice a week. And this is the really awful bit. You also are supposed to get your heart rate up, above 80% maximum for 15 minutes a couple of times a week. So you're walking the dog 5K 4 times a week, that's great. But when you come to that hill, you should try and walk up it as quickly as you possibly can a couple of times a week, even if it hurts. And there's pretty solid evidence around that. And I think the community advisor, probably you'll be talking about all of these things. So I won't steal your thunder anymore. Make sure you get some sun and are not vitamin D deficient, but maybe don't take too much. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I highlighted also depression and anxiety. There's this really intriguing data, but really solid data from the Swedish National Registry. And they're showing that of all the comorbidities, comorbid conditions, other diseases, other illnesses that you might have, depression actually has a significant impact on MS outcomes. It's about as bad as smoking. It makes it about 30% worse. So seek help and support if you can, I think. Okay. So this is becoming really popular in Australia, hopefully here also, which is kind of online wheelchair exercise. So lots of people in chairs are doing this online individually or in groups, and lots of people that come and see our health service do that. So just because you're in a chair doesn't mean you can't exercise. And this is just a populist picture. And I've noticed this as well. After you do that intensive exercise, so you get on an exercise bike and really go hell for leather for 15 minutes, once you have survived, the sweats stop dripping off you, and then you do like something on your phone, like a game or something, you can do it better. Like for 20 minutes or half an hour, you have actually increased cognition. It's quite incredible. Okay, so what about these standards of care? And some of these standards of care are really going to hurt because they're hard, but they were actually self-defined by 60 MS experts, by which I mean people with MS, nurses, representatives from patient organizations, MS societies, and doctors, neurologists specializing in MS from all over the world. And there was a process called the Delphi process, which I don't want to go into, but it's essentially a way of finding consensus by repeatedly showing people certain statements until they all agree, or you drop the statement if you can't get agreement. And so the idea was that there would be a core value, I guess, for a particular item. You'll see the items in a second, it will make more sense. So minimum standard, then what they would consider to be good, and what people would consider to be exceptional. So core, achievable, or aspirational standards. And so I'll show you what 60 international experts consider to be an achievable standard of diagnosis. Reporting first symptoms. So anyone who reports symptoms that might be related to MS to a healthcare professional should be referred to a neurologist within 10 days. That's not 10 months, 10 days. An initial MRI scan should be performed within 2 weeks of the first referral to a neurologist for diagnosis. And the diagnostic workup should be essentially complete within 4 weeks to be able to make an accurate diagnosis. The initial appointment should be at least 45 minutes in length. And for treatment decisions, it says the MS team should discuss the aims of treatment with each patient within 2 weeks of the diagnosis, pros and cons of early DMT, and should discuss eligibility and should be offered within 3 weeks of becoming eligible for disease-modifying treatment, and should commence at no more than 2 weeks after that. But these are tight because people have recognized that that early stage of MS is a great stage to intervene and to prevent the development of new lesions. And there should be an appointment every 6 months at which also the current treatment plan should at least be touched on. Most of the time it will be fine. You know, you're on your medication, you're not getting relapses, you have maybe no new lesions on the scan, your neurological examination stays the same, and you don't have any side effects or significant side effects from your treatment, there's nothing needs to be done, but at least that needs to be formally ticked off as such. Then for monitoring, it says, for example, that the achievable standard should be a clinical evaluation at least every 6 months. In many places, that's now alternating with telehealth appointments and a physical review every 12 months for stable patients, of course. All patients with MS should be offered an MRI scan, at least of the brain, at least once a year. And the data that people are collecting on patients with MS should be stored in some kind of database or registry. And the reason for that is that MS is a long disease, and medical records they're really not very user-friendly for working out what drugs someone has been on in the past, or all the things that have happened to people. So we think that having some systematic recorded approach actually aids management of MS greatly, because you can see the picture of the disease over time, ideally like in the one spot, not in 29 letters from the past. Okay. So we then, between 2017 and 2020, the Brain Health Organization actually funded a research project, an audit of MS centers. So there were 17 centers from 14 countries participated, including 2 New Zealand centers in Dunedin and Wellington. Over 50% of the responders rated the tool very easy or easy to use and very relevant to their service. I'll show you a little bit more of that data. And so of the 17 centers, 13 completed the post-audit survey. And so the idea here is that these 17 centers are taking 36 records of patients with MS and are finding out whether they met these various standards or not. And again, sending that information to the Brain Health Organization. And many of the responders who did this actually liked it and plan to introduce changes to their service, including improvements in documentation, communication, interaction with colleagues, and referrals. And many of them were interested in using a shorter version of the tool. It was a little bit burdensome initially, but here's some of the responses. So this is clinicians, mainly nurses and neurologists, saying that they felt that what was touched on the tool in terms of timeliness of referral and diagnosis, treatment decisions, the brain healthy lifestyle, disease monitoring, managing new symptoms, were very important. They were important. And I won't show individual center data at this point. But as a group, you know, there's room to improve. So the people who achieved at least the core or did better is a percentage on the right-hand side. So this is for patients. So what we can see is that, for example, that initial MRI scan timeliness was met in quite a lot of cases. 83% of people had the MRI scan within a couple of weeks. Globally, this includes places in Iran and Turkey. Whereas the diagnosis made and communicated ultimately in that 5-week time frame, it was only about 2/3. But what neurologists maybe would have considered slightly softer skills were worse. There was a standard around offering cognitive screening at the start, but that's since been dropped because it's actually unachievable. There's not the workforce to do that. And maybe also not the need. But discussing a brain healthy lifestyle was around 60%. And the discussion of the aims of treatment, what is your treatment supposed to do, also occurred in some way, documented in only 60% of patients. So room to improve. So what do we want to do now? Well, it's long occurred to us that there's a whole huge hidden factor here, because you're only probably engaging health services that want to be engaged, that take some pride in their MS care, and that fundamentally think it's not too bad, because you wouldn't volunteer for something that you think is going to be terrible. So this is self-selected based on volunteers, volunteer centers. So we would like to create some kind of tool, ideally phone-based or maybe a red cap tool that people with MS can also use. You know, perhaps anonymously, but they can actually look at the standards and see whether they were and are continuing to be met. Not to name and shame, but simply to look at the at the distribution of care. So, for example, in New Zealand, it'd be really interesting to see what that's like for someone living in Auckland versus someone living in a small village that's quite remote. And that might be very, very powerful data. So it'd be interesting to benchmark between countries. It'd be definitely very interesting benchmark between regions in a country. We all think that city people, for example, generally get much better care than country people. And to measure change over time. Right? These tools can also be used by a service to try and improve their care. Because they know, oh, I'm actually really good here. I'm not so good here. I'm not talking about a brain healthy lifestyle or comorbidities or smoking with my patients. What resources are out there to help people stop smoking? And so it's a continuous improvement process. Here's my favorite quote. It's actually from Lord Kelvin. The measure is to know, and if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So this is measuring care. Okay. Half an hour. Sorry. I'm passionate about brain health. So the report is also being updated actually at this year's ECTRIM. So there will be a 2025, I suppose, publication. Much broader evidence base. A huge amount of additional evidence has been gathered, especially around things like physical exercise, smoking, depression, as I mentioned. So many years ago, we embarked on this project to try and answer this question. Should I take vitamin D? And if so, how much? And if you Google MS and vitamin D, there's millions, I think more than 9.5 million hits. People saying all kinds of things. And there's some guy in Brazil who is treating his patients with 100,000 units a day of vitamin D. Should you do that? Is it helpful? Who knows? There's a very significant kind of compelling story around vitamin D. And this data also exists in exactly the same way for New Zealand in terms of prevalence. But it is the factor that people kind of believed would underlie the latitudinal gradient, right? Because the closer to the equator you are, the less MS you get, the colder, the more MS there is. The same in New Zealand. I think there's much less MS in the north of the North Island than in the south of the South Island. Very much, this is Australian data of first events, so it's like a prospective study. Something that was called the Autoimmune MS Incidence Study, done a long time ago now, but it showed that if you were in Tasmania, you had a significantly higher incidence than if you were in Victoria. If you were just north of Sydney in New South Wales, much lower. And if you were in Brisbane, which is only halfway up Australia, lower again. And in fact, that difference is already fourfold. And we think that in the far north, like Townsville or Cairns, it's half again. So very, very powerful. I can't name anything that reduces your risk of getting MS eightfold or increases it eightfold, but where you live does. And of course, what's different about these places is the amount of sunlight. And what does sunlight do? It produces vitamin D in the skin. Same rays that burn you also produce vitamin D in the skin. And this is actually a graph also from that same study, the autoimmune study. And it was looking at individual people who were just diagnosed with MS because they just had their first scan. And what their personal blood vitamin D levels were actually like, and it was compared to controls in the community that, were essentially their neighbors, taken from the electoral roll. And it showed that you were much less likely to be diagnosed with MS if you had a high vitamin D level. So this curve going down is actually the decreasing likelihood of getting MS with higher and higher vitamin D levels. So how does this work? It could just work like that. The sun makes vitamin D, and the vitamin D causes less lesions. Right. Or it could be that the sun does something else. The latitudinal gradient does something else to our body. Believe it or not, but there's a whole world of so-called photoimmunology. So this is like the effect of light on the immune system, not all of which is mediated through vitamin D, but it's mediated by light exposure. So higher vitamin D levels are going to, they measure your light exposure, your sunlight exposure. But the effect might still actually be flowing through a different mechanism. So we had to work this out. And what we did was to, with massive support in New Zealand, actually, we recruited 200 patients with earliest possible MS, untreated otherwise, and then randomly assigned them to different doses of vitamin D. And the hypothesis is that oral vitamin D supplementation would reduce the risk of relapse or new lesions. So in the end, of those 200 people, there's about 130 from Australia and about 70 from New Zealand, which is a pretty massive effort. And we gave them randomly, they didn't know, we didn't know what it was, so either placebo or 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 units of vitamin D every day. And we measured whether they would develop either new MS lesions or relapses, or both. I like this photo because it dates the study. This is the ethics application. going into the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Thank God we don't kill as many trees anymore. And that's me at the start and at the end of the study. So what happened? When you give people high doses of vitamin D, their vitamin D levels go really high. And that is as shown here. So the yellow were the people getting 10,000 units, and you can see how high their vitamin D levels average 200 nanomoles per liter. Whereas people were getting placebo or 1,000 units, I mean, there was a significant difference, but it was, much, much lower. So unfortunately, that's actually all it did. It was one of the greatest disappointments of my life to uncrack the code and see the results. So after 1 year, the people taking placebo, just over half, 54%. Sorry, it's the number down here. It's going to be impossible in the video to see. I'm sorry about that. 54% developed new lesions or relapses. If you're taking 1,000 units a day, it's 51%. 5,000, 65%, 10,000, 63%. So this kind of trend to actually perhaps even more. And overall, 58%. So absolutely no effect of vitamin D. So you should take 1,000 units a day to protect your bones, but no more. This is our paper. Vitamin D did not improve disease activity after first event. So how does it work? I don't know. But I'm done with researching. I'm done with researching that. Someone else can work that out. It's just some of the people involved in the prevalence study. All right, onto some interesting things. Progressive MS, possible new drugs, new ways of measuring progression, and new approaches to making trials faster, cheaper, better, which is what we need. Because at the moment, progressive MS trials are long and hard and costly, which is why people are not that interested in doing them anymore, unfortunately. So what's out there? Well, one of them, so all of these things that I'm mentioning now have no proven benefit in MS yet. They're all in trials. So this is going to be in a UK and Australian MS Society funded trial. I don't think so there will be trial sites in New Zealand for this one, which is why I can mention it. If you had MS, you could consider taking this. There is a study, 600 milligrams twice a day, of this so-called nutraceutical. So it's not quite a vitamin because it's not essential for life. But it's an antioxidant, essentially, nutraceutical. It's been quite popular, and there have been a number of trials in various neurological conditions. the strongest evidence in MS, there's lots and lots of animal evidence, but the strongest evidence in MS is a 2-year, relatively small, placebo-controlled randomized study in secondary progressive MS with only about 60 patients. The reference is down the bottom there, it was published in 2017. And they used brain volume change as a marker for progression. And that was reduced by 2/3, with a strong trend towards better walking speed in the active group. All that means is that this is worth studying in a much larger group. It's not definitive evidence, but it's a sort of evidence that a committee that is conducting this big trial called Octopus Platypus, which I'll get back to in the end, octopus in England, platypus in Australia, so selected as one of the drugs to go into the trial. It also is dirt cheap and really safe. Some skin rashes, but 60 capsules of this cost $13, just saying. This is less cheap. We'll get to the reason for this, but Roche is conducting a double-dose octopus study. So octopus is actually approved for primary progressive MS in New Zealand, and they wanted to see if giving people twice as much has a better effect. And the reason for that is that, I'll get to this in more detail in a minute, is that we feel that a lot of primary progressive MS still has some inflammation associated with it, but it's kind of hidden. It's hidden behind what's called the blood-brain barrier. So we have a very tight barrier between our blood system and our brain and spinal cord in order to prevent bugs and viruses, bacteria from getting in there. Unfortunately, it also prevents lots of other things from getting in there, and one of those is antibodies. So only about 1% of the body antibody levels circulate into the brain. So this is a massive overdose for killing B cells in the brain, which is how this drug works. But it's not probably a massive overdose for trying to kill B cells in the brain. It's like pushing a whole lot of extra drug in there in order to get more into the brain, where we presume the action in primary progressive MS is actually taking place. So this is going to be really interesting. Might be even in September, October this year, but I'm not 100% sure. This is also really interesting. So another way of potentially eliminating those B cells, including in the brain, is something which, just like ocrelizumab, actually comes from the cancer world. And some people are calling this bone marrow transplant light. But it's not really, because it's much, much more specific than that. But essentially what this is reprogramming your own immune cells more or less as a one hit to kill all your B cells. And because we're not using a drug, we're using a cell, like your own immune cells, your own T cells. And we're basically turning them with genetic engineering against your B cells. So they go, they kill a B cell, they die. They can get into the brain, and they can get into the spinal cord, because the cells have special mechanisms for trafficking. So there are trials of CAR T-cell therapy in progressive forms of MS about to start. The beauty of this would be that it would be a once-off. People can get quite unwell with these treatments, but much less unwell than with bone marrow transplant. Because they use standard old-style chemo, which affects many, many cells, whereas this really just affects the B cells. And this is just a picture of a T cell killing a B cell. There's also a whole other group of drugs that are also being tried in progressive MS. Collectively, these are called Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or BTKI. And that was Bruton, Ogden Bruton, who didn't discover this molecule at all, but he did discover a young boy with a severe problem with the immune system who was getting essentially pneumonia and other forms of terrible bacterial infections all the time. And then he was given some antibodies from other people, and he improved with monthly intervals of this treatment. Later on, that boy was discovered to have a deficiency, a mutation in Bruton's tyrosine kinase, which stopped him from producing his own antibody. Of course, we don't want to stop people from producing their own antibodies altogether. But lesser versions of inhibiting it, not having it is, of course, extreme inhibition, but lesser versions of inhibiting it are called the Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And there are two of them listed here, tolebrutinib and fenebrutinib, which are being trialed right now in a non-relapsing secondary progressive MS and in primary progressive MS. So these are tablets taken once or twice a day. A reasonable tolerability. And whether they're going to be effective in primary or secondary progressive MS, we don't know. But I wanted to give you a landscape of what's actually happening and what maybe we will see in the future. So now I wanted to tie all of that together a bit for you with what I think is a really, really exciting discovery. And I'm getting to the pearls and cells. So many, many times we do a scan on someone with MS who's getting worse. They're on a highly effective treatment. They've got no new lesions in their brain. They've got no new lesions in their spinal cord. And reasonably they say, why am I getting worse? What's happening? And we can say, well, you have progressive MS. It might, the treatments don't work nearly as well for progressive MS. But what is that? So if someone then pushes us and says, well, how does that happen? We used to wave our hands and say, oh, well, it could be all kinds of things. And there was normally a list of 12 or 15 things, which usually means we don't know. And there may still be 12 or 15 things, but one of those things is becoming increasingly clear is involved. And it's really about what can happen to an existing lesion. I might skip forward a little bit to this slide and show you. This is a concept slide of what can happen to a lesion. We'll just start in the middle. That's a new MS lesion. It's full of immune cells. Of all kinds of different flavors, macrophages, T cells, B cells, different kinds of the immune system, all attacking largely the myelin sheath and killing it. So that is what you might see in MS if you were able to take a biopsy of a new lesion that's just happened. Thankfully, our brain and our immune system has breaks in it. So the new lesion doesn't kill the whole brain, it stops. It goes to a certain size, it stops. And when it stops, one of two things happens to the inflammation. Most commonly, this happens. The inflammation disappears, and we have a lesion which is now called an inactive lesion. Sometimes that doesn't seem to happen. And what happens instead is this picture here, where immune cells sit or remain around the edge of the lesion, like a very low, slow burning fire, and continue to do damage around the rim. And also, in fact, expand that rim. So this is actually a relatively logical mechanism why someone might still be getting worse without any new lesions, because this is already happening in existing lesions. And so Pearl stands for paramagnetic rim lesion, and it's detecting, so you can hopefully see an area of a higher level of magnetic signal around the center of some lesions. So here's a lesion. Then when people do specific ion sequences, they can see this kind of rim that's bright. That's actually iron. And we believe that iron is sitting inside the cells that are in the rim of that lesion. So pearls is one way of measuring this activity. And perhaps a more longitudinal, longer-term way is something called a cell, which actually just stands for slowly expanding lesion. So here's an example of a cell. The person who is scanned, actually this person is being scanned over 20 years, and this same lesion gradually, slowly expands. It's not a new lesion, it grows. Most slowly expanding lesions seem to do this for about 8 or 10 years and then stop expanding by themselves. Here's another picture of it. This is from a human brain, an autopsy. And the top picture just shows you where the lesion is, because the brown is a myelin stain. So the border between the white, loss of the myelin, and the brown, the normal myelin, is the lesion. And I guess you have to read this really almost from left to right. Here's all the cells inside an active lesion. All these pink dots are cells. You can see it's packed full of immune cells. And then on the left-hand side is, they're all gone. That's a chronic inactive lesion. In the middle, though, is this so-called chronic active lesion, where not so much in the middle, but around the rim of the lesion, there are still these immune cells present. So it's just another actual way of showing the same thing. Now, we don't seem to have, if we have MS, if you have MS, you don't seem to have too many of those, but you have some. There's just some stats around that. In a whole series of scans from this particular research study, people had 23 lesions on average, and definitely slowly expanding lesions over several scans was actually less than 10% of the magnitude. But they found them in most people with MS. So why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because it provides one explanation why someone might be getting worse in spite of not getting new lesions. The existing lesions might still have some inflammation in it, might still grow. It's also interesting because it's a hopeful treatment target, and we can measure it. So this could actually be the readout for MS treatment programs, where you do a small study on people with MS, with progressive MS. You find people who have slowly expanding lesions. You give them the drug for maybe 6 months and you see if it stops. And that gives you a whole lot of confidence to go to the big phase 3 trials that we're lacking. So this is what's called a phase 2 design, where you are trying to find the effect of the drug on a biomarker. And if you are wanting to develop a new drug for hypertension, for high blood pressure, got a really easy biomarker, you just measure the blood pressure. But actually to get approval for that drug to be paid for by the government, you have to show that it has an ultimate effect, that it reduces your risk of stroke or heart disease. And so the high blood pressure is actually a biomarker. And this could be, hopefully, one of the long searched for biomarkers for progressive illness. I know I'm probably way over time, but I've got like 2 or 3 more slides. My passion project has been to use this as another biomarker for progression. And it's actually, these are almost ubiquitous. Hands up, who in this room does not have a smartphone? Looks like 0. And many people have 2, which and we do lots of things on our phones, I don't need to tell you. And also, I don't need to tell you that they're very clever. They have all kinds of sensors in them. So we could get people to do things on their phone that actually measure neurological function. So these are, or for the phone just to measure function. Or if you have a smartphone, it almost certainly has a pedometer in it, and you can get your step count. Well, that's what I'm talking about. That's a passive monitoring tool, right? So the idea would be that if we saw your step counts gradually declining, well, your MS might be getting worse. Active ones are actually things that you do, like little games that you play, that could measure your coordination or cognitive function. I'll show you one of them in a second. The problem with them, there's been quite a lot of research over 10 years now in this space. The problem with them is that passive tests like walking speed are very noisy in terms of the data. Like if you actually look at your step count from month to month, it might vary by 10 or 20% just randomly. If you do have it, look at it, because you'll see how noisy that data is. And there are privacy concerns around passive monitoring. There are all kinds of things that can be done technically, but do you really want to install an app that monitors how quickly you type, including your passwords? Probably not. And active tests actually somewhat bothersome and a bit boring. They're fun to do for a little while, but then we have to do it every week or every day or twice a week. You just get jack of it. So ongoing participation in these projects really drops off, so that only about 20 or 30% of people love them and keep doing them forever, no matter how long and how much. So we've been working on an active one to measure cognitive function, but not in a way that you think. It's actually just measuring various versions of reaction time. So it's now an app on the phone, or you can do it on the phone via a web browser, or it was initially programmed in Brazil, hence soccer balls. So what you first see when you do the test is just a soccer ball appears, and you press a button when you see it. It's literally a reaction time. It takes about 110, 120 milliseconds for you to react. The second one is that you can press one or other button on the screen depending on the color of the ball. That takes a bit longer because you have to process a little bit. And the third one is the so-called one-back test. You get a series of playing cards displayed on the screen. You simply have to say whether the card that you see now is the same as the last one or different to the last one. So you have to remember that a little bit in your working. Again, a bit harder still. So what these tests can look like, people who do them see them on their phone, they can see their results. They look like this. They're a little bit noisy. The blue one is at the bottom. That's the fastest. That's just detecting. The red one is working out whether it's one or the other, and the yellow one is the one back. And here's a person who, over the course of, 3 years, seems to be completely stable. They're not stable on every test. You can see some variation, but because this is a simple test, it's over in about 3 minutes, people don't seem to mind doing it. And they do it once a week or once a month, and we can certainly see that if we draw the lines, the yellow line, the red line, and the blue line, they're all stable. Here's a person who's actually not. So here's a person who is clearly, slowly getting worse. Right? So if we look at the blue line and the red line and the yellow line, they're all slowly getting worse. So it's taking longer and longer and longer for them to do the test. So this kind of thing could also be a biomarker in progressive MS studies. It's very, very cheap. It doesn't cost us anything for you to do the test. And it's responsive to progression. So what we've shown is in the longer term cohorts of this, is that if you don't have this pattern, so if you're not getting worse on this score, you cannot get worse on what's called the EDSS score, which is our major evaluation in clinical trials of progressive MS. That's a sign to finish if I've ever heard one. God is calling me. All right, I'm literally down to the last slide. Octopus and platypus, getting back to these. This is the framework in which alpha lipoic acid is going to be studied, also another drug called metformin. It'll start later this year. People will be randomly assigned to placebo, metformin, or alpha lipoic acid in the first phase. But the exciting thing about this is actually something that really excites me and that most people find really boring. It's actually the platform. So let's say I am a really innovative drug company and I want to start a trial in progressive MS. So if I go to some companies that specialize in finding trial sites all over the world, often I might engage a few of them. So investigators will then get feasibility assessment. You know, do you want to do this trial? How many people? So you fill them in 3 or 4 times, often for the same trial. You might hear nothing. Or eventually, 6 or 7 months later, they contact you and say, oh, we want to have another chat to you. A few months later, they say, look, your trial site might be a goer for this trial. A few months later, the company might contact you. And we're now talking about lead-up times of 2 years or more from the first survey to when you have all the ethics approvals or the governance approvals, the drug is in the country, and you can finally consent someone and give them the drug. That's a huge amount of time, and it's a huge waste of time because it just gets repeated over and over and over and over again. So the alternative, which really comes from cancer, cuts down the cost and the time of conducting a trial by between 30 and 50%. And for a phase 2 trial, that's 30 to 50% is about $20 to $40 million. And it's to do them potentially in parallel. If you have more than one drug that you want to try, use one placebo group and randomize people 1 to 1 to 1. Or 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, if you want to. And if you have the framework set up, new people with progressive MS can just go into the trial every year, every 6 months. You do an interim analysis, and you say, oh, this one is promising. This one didn't work. It just gets stopped, and another drug can get substituted in. Another drug can get substituted in. And all you're doing in the ethics approvals is to say, using exactly the same framework and exactly the same approvals, we now want to test drug 64. Drug 64 has these characteristics, and we're going to amend our consent form accordingly. So this makes sense. And this is what octopus and platypus are trying to do for the first time in MS. To stand up around 40 sites in the UK and in Australia, to just do this all the time and to hopefully attract great interest from the pharmaceutical companies to actually use this mechanism, this framework for their progressive MS trial. And so, and if it's successful, of course, that network can grow and grow and grow and makes things twice as fast and twice as cheap. So what I've told you today about progressive MS is that new trial approaches for progressive MS will include measuring progression in new ways, such as cells or hopefully also smartphone-based apps, and that we're in the process of developing really efficient trial platforms, because it isn't actually the drugs that are the problem. Like lots and lots of basic research has been done. There are hundreds of drugs that we could try. There just isn't the money to try them. And I think this is like the solution to that. So finally, I'm finished. Thank you very much for your extremely long attention spans. This is our center at the Alfred. Some of the leading doctors and nurses there. I want to thank them very much for providing excellent care for people with MS. Thank you for your attention.
Helmut has graciously agreed to take questions. Can I just make one plea that the questions are not speeches, and that you don't address to him your own particular situation and expect him to make clinical judgments on your own particular circumstances. So, Helmut, I've got a first question, and it relates to the first report of brain health. There was very little in the program that you discussed there of the role of MS societies and the role of people like our clinical advisors that see people with MS probably far more frequently in some respects than the MS nurse or the MS urologist. And I just wondered in the new version whether you would address that.
I think what we thought about is the care system. Like, what should the care system do? The care system, which also included the respondents on the survey that set the standards, definitely included several nurses and several patient organizations. So the answer is yes, but it was already there. And you know, we've strapped healthcare resources and healthcare dollars. Anyone in a multidisciplinary team that can provide care or advice or support for people with MS can do parts of this. Super important.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question, Helmut. This is I'm Roland Matthews. I was researched by Giovannoni, Burt and Federico that says stem cell treatment is trending a cure. The caveat that Giovannoni said is that it just hasn't been long enough. It hasn't been around for like another 20 years, and then we'll be certain as to how effective it is. What's your take on that? And do you think it should be a first-line treatment for MS?
So what we're talking about here is relapsing remitting MS. Okay, so in progressive forms of MS, generally stem cell transplants make people worse. Sometimes really badly worse. But in relapsing remitting MS, it could certainly be a first-line treatment for MS. Some people have chosen to do that. It's just that it isn't actually better than Ocrevus, for example. Right? So our studies looking at the registries of bone marrow transplantation in MS space, and other studies also suggest that it's a very high efficacy treatment for MS, but no better than other high efficacy treatments for MS. However, its potential advantage is, of course, that once you reconstitute your immune system and recover from the bone marrow transplant, after about 5 years, your immune system is essentially normal and you're not taking any more drugs. And the relapse rates, new lesions, new attacks after that are very, are very few and far between. Right? So you could say, well, there's a theoretical advantage. over having to take a drug all the time. I think the main issues that need to be talked about in that is actually cost and side effects. So most of the chemotherapy regimes, for example, that we would use in these sort of in bone marrow transplants cause menopause, for example. And most people with relapsing remitting MS diagnosed, from 70 or 80% of them are women who are fertile. And that's just one example. So normally people take a very significant hit on their quality of life in terms of fatigue and cognitive impairment for about a year to 18 months, and then it gets better. So I've answered the question in a long way. You could do it, but I think it's no better than the existing things that we have, and it's more dangerous.
Got another question? Graham.
Whereabouts are we at with the vitamin D recommendations at the moment?
1,000 units maximum.
And we think that it is useful, or is it just a safety?
I think levels beyond that are useless and potentially slightly dangerous, based on the trial. So people who were taking high doses, 5,000 or 10,000, had verging on more relapses. Right. So low dose vitamin D was however not like that. It was certainly very safe, and it may well be useful for other things like your bone health.
So it's fat soluble, it's pretty easy to take at 1,000.
It's cheap. It helps the New Zealand economy because almost all the vitamin D3 sold in the world is made from New Zealand sheep fat.
We've got a question at the right at the back there.
Hi there. On one of your slides, you indicated that the lesions in progressive MS reach a point of where there's no growth.
Yeah, so typically in people with progressive MS, not always, but typically, there are no new lesions, either in the brain or in the spinal cord. And we had a lot of trouble explaining why people actually get worse, but it now seems to be that the existing lesions can have this effect of chronic activity where they slowly expand. And we're learning to monitor that.
So is there still any merit in doing an MRI?
I think we certainly do them less in people with progressive MS. And if they have a new symptom, like an unexpected symptom that could be a relapse, we definitely want to do another scan. But if we learn to measure these cells, we may be very keen on doing more of them, because that would be the way that we could measure these slowly expanding lesions. At the moment, it's actually at the research phase. Like your radiologist in an MS center, or doing MRI scans serially, can almost not spot these, unless they really look at 4, 5, or 6 in a row. And even then, it's really hard, because it's already hard enough to look at 200 lesions that somebody might have. And then to work out whether one of them is getting very slowly bigger is a monumental task. It would take an awfully long time manually. Which is why there are a whole lot of groups around the world working on automated detection.
So I guess that technology is it here in New Zealand?
It's not yet here anywhere in the world, only in the research centers.
Thank you.
Another question? I think I've got one task to do after we've thanked Helmut, but I admitted in terms of the organisers responsible for this meeting to mention also the sterling work that MS Auckland did in helping put this together, and Nicola and Jan, I apologise for that. It's always a problem when you single people out that you forget somebody, but No, never fear. I've asked Jan Holway, who's president of MS Auckland and vice president of MS New Zealand, to come forward and thank them. And there's one other thing after this.
Thank you, Neil. It's no problem. We are very happy to be here, of course. And I'm not sure how many people here are from Auckland, but I do know there's many people from outside the region. So welcome and thank you for coming. It's my pleasure, of course, to, on your behalf, thank Helmut for his address today. There's a couple of take-homes that I've got lots of notes all over the place, but there are a few take-homes that I felt were quite pertinent for us all to take back on with our gratitude. And the first one is really about people with MS needing to be an active participant in their journey, in the sense that Helmut has given us so much information that is ours to use in a way that enhances and adds value to our processes and the way we engage with our neurologists and our MS societies and our MS nurses. So that's the first added value that Helmut's given us, given me in particular tonight. And the other thing that that was mentioned but only lightly was about MS Base as the data receptor that is the collective international pool of data about people with MS. And that the work that Helmut does in that area really gels for me because it makes the journey one of the 180,000, is it? 108, not 180. Okay, so 109,000 people with MS, and we are part of that collective body of people sharing their data to help each other, as well as the researchers and the neurologists that do the work around that data. So power to data is one of the other messages that I wanted to bring forward. The use of technology is just so exciting. I really love the way you express the difference between the active and passive use of data, and my husband teases me endlessly because my data collection methodology for my health is to weigh myself every morning and sometimes more than once a day. So my data collection method, I'm not quite sure why I've gone to that level with it, but he is exactly the same, and he has an Apple Watch, and he tells me down to the minute how much sleep he had and how much sleep deprivation he's had over the last month. So we balance each other out well there. So the active and passive side of that data that again embodies your ability to take care of your MS processes is part of that use of technology, and the new things that are happening, and the most absorbing part of your address, apart from the photo of you being young and old, was the insight into research and how it works and how it supports us all and brings forward the assumptions and moves them into a reality and then lets them go because the research is showing that it's no longer of value or valid, and there's new things coming through which are more supportive. And I think that the last thing, and I think resonates for very many people here, is the support and the research that's taking place for progressive MS, primary progressive. There's been a lot of recent history and work for primary relapsing remitting, and to hear some really cutting research and progress for primary progressive is just another big boost to our knowledge and understanding. So I've heard Helmut speak a few times. He's a speaker who always engages with his audience. He makes sense for us. He helps us understand and take on board the knowledge that he holds. And I think also that he uplifts us all in his commitment and application of the data that bores down on the issues that we are addressing and helps us to resolve them over time. And what's the best thing to do becomes clearer and clearer because of the work that Helmut and his team does. So on behalf of all of us, could we thank Helmut? Thank you.
I'm going to go completely off the purpose of the evening now, just for 2 minutes. There are 3 people in the audience who are very important to MS, and they're sitting over there, 3 gentlemen from the Rotary Club of Half Moon Bay, and I'd ask you please to come forward. Rod and Ian and John. About 5 or 6 years ago, I got a call from one of these gentlemen to say, we do a thing called Bangers to Bluff, and we would like MS New Zealand to be the headline charity. I immediately saw when I understood what Bangers to Bluff was, which was basically you buy a car for $2,000 or less and you drive it to Bluff where it's sold, you raise money on the way, and that money goes to charity. And it's not a big club. It would be, 60 members probably? 44 members. And over the years, they've raised now nearly $250,000 for MS. For the last 4 years, we've had 2 conspirators in the room. I'd asked Jeff and Graham to come forward. They have each year driven a vehicle. The first one we bought was a Peugeot in Tauranga on the advice of one of Graham's car mates. It made it to the top of the Kaimais before it boiled. We managed to coast to Matamata, and at that stage we parked it in Matamata while we went and bought another Peugeot for $1,000, and we actually pirated just one part, which was the plastic water overfill for the radiator. The Peugeot, and I drove with these 2, it was a 2-door Peugeot. We drove all the way. The next year was COVID, and although the rally didn't take place, these gentlemen very generously donated, and the participants donated their entrance fees, and so even though the rally didn't take place, the next year we had a 2-door VW, and the 3 of us, I decided I wouldn't go to the North Island with them, but I joined them in the South Island. And I can tell you, driving a 2-door VW with no heater, no air conditioning, through the snow towards Mount Cook. And a bike in the boot. And a bike in the boot. Sitting in the back seat is not something that you want to repeat too often. Last year we had another VW, didn't we, which did have air conditioning this time. But the other thing that we do just need to acknowledge also is that Graham, despite his MS, is a keen cyclist. There's a bike rack on the back of the vehicle, and most mornings he gets up before anybody else and rides out, and Jeff or I follow in the car and pick him up somewhere along the way, except when we left the chateau and he devoted into the car wreckers that was made famous in the movies some years ago. We drove on to Owakuni getting more and more worried because we couldn't find him. When we turned around to come back, there he was. He knew the woman who was the secretary at this establishment. She'd made him scones and coffee, and he was totally unaware that we were in it. But anyway, I've said enough, but we did just want, on behalf of MS and people with MS, gentlemen, to acknowledge in a very small way your contribution. Okay?
May I say that The comradeship and the working together that Half Moon Bay Rotary and MS has had and still do have is phenomenal. It's fair to say, as Neil mentioned earlier, that we did have a predecessor that we supported, but we have found that MS has just been the best to work for. And we are so proud that the money that we have raised has done so much good for you guys. We are planning next year's event. Rod has taken over from me. Rod is leading it. We take off on the 25th of March. We look forward to your support, whether you do it on Give a Little or whether you want to enter. There's probably a couple of vacancies. And so if you partake, as these two guys do, you know that the majority of the money comes back to you. So on behalf of Half Moon Bay Rotary, I thank you for this. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that winds up the formal part of the evening. You're welcome to stay on and chat with members of the Research Trust, members of MS Auckland, members of MS New Zealand. I trust that those of you that are driving have a safe trip home, and we'll see you in due course in the next little while. Thank you very much.